We all have challenges in life: sadness, broken relationships, anger, bullying, grief, and isolation. But there is hope. Together, we can learn how to bring back joy, re engage with life, restore relationships, and to be alone without being lonely. Welcome to Psychology Talks.
We're going to be talking about navigating relationships, a super important topic that I think we can all benefit from. We're going to have with us today Dr. Julie Shaffer. Thank you for being with us today.
Oh, thank you, Angela, for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So Dr. Shaffer is a clinical psychologist. She has been in private practice for a long time now, about 14 years. She has also been a VA psychologist, and Dr. Shaffer has been the president of the Oregon Psychological Association. So she has a lot of experience to offer us. And now she's also a life coach, and she's going to tell us about that as well.
I am. Yeah, I'm excited to be here and talk about this. This is great.
Yeah. So Julie, why don't you tell us a little bit about the difference in what a psychologist is and what a life coach is?
Yeah, good question. I get it a lot because, as you can imagine, there's quite a bit of overlap. I have been doing psychotherapy with people for mental health issues since since before private practice, but in my private practice since 2005. And when I'm doing that, I'm really helping people navigate their emotional lives, their mood, and function better, like at work and home. And so it's about bringing somebody who's struggling with mental illness back up to a level of function that's able to work for them. And when I'm coaching, I'm taking a person who's generally functioning pretty well in their life. They don't really meet the diagnostic criteria for a mental illness, but they have some problems.
Yeah.
And so I'm helping them work on those problems, navigate those relationships, and take their life up to the next level.
Okay. So when you're doing the coaching, it sounds like there's going to be an element of that where you're not looking to see if there's a diagnosis even.
No. Although as a psychologist, I could tune into that.
Absolutely.
I would be able to recognize that probably a little more than a life coach or relationship coach who doesn't have the same background I do.
Okay. And so that seems like there might be some questions then about payer and who's going to be paying for the treatment or who's going to be paying for the sessions that you have and how all of that works. Can you explain that piece?
Right. So if you have a diagnosis of a mood disorder, anxiety disorder, any other mental health issue, then your insurance company, assuming you have health insurance, is going to be able to pick up that bill, or at least a big portion of that bill. Whereas if you're going to do life coaching, you're going to be paying for that out of pocket yourself. That's not, health insurance pays for medically necessary treatment.
Okay. So what you're going to be looking for a life coach if maybe you're not necessarily concerned about anxiety, or you're not concerned about, or maybe there might be some low levels of anxiety, but it's not impairing your functioning, it's not impairing your life.
Right.
Where you're looking for a life coach if what you want is to navigate a specific aspect of your life and just to take it to the next level where that's no longer an issue.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Can you give an example of what that might look like?
Sure. Well, I've worked with people in a number of different areas. So, because I'm a relationship life coach, I work a lot with people with their relationships. So oftentimes they're in a marriage and they've been in there for a number of years, and marriage gets hard after a while.
Yeah.
So they come to me as individuals, and we talk about what's going on, how their past is playing a role in this, and how they can start to make changes in how they're interacting with their partner so that they're bringing their best version of themselves to the relationship, and thereby creating an even better relationship between the two of them.
Right. So you're doing that without the aspect of any kind of pathology.
Right.
And so for those that might not know what pathology is when we're looking at abnormal psychological function.
Right. Exactly.
And so it's not something that is to that level where it necessitates having a diagnosis. It's just something that they might need a little bit of help with.
Right. So I help people a lot with exploring their emotions and how to communicate them, how to communicate assertively, how to figure out what their needs and values are so that they can be more themselves and express themselves
Okay.
better.
Okay.
Yeah.
And those are things that we do in therapy as well.
Yes, we do.
But there's a little different focus here.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And that's why I say there's a lot of overlap. Some of the same skills that I use with people who have a mental health diagnosis also apply if you're just trying to solve a problem.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the reason we asked you to be on the show today is because you have written a book that talks about how to navigate relationships.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so this is a wonderful book, and I've had a chance to look at it, and you have some really important concepts and rules that you have discovered and that you explore in this book. So why don't we talk about what those are?
Well, let's see, there's 7 of them, and these were rules or guidelines. I mean, some people like the word guideline or principle better, but rules was a shorter, more pithier statement.
Sure.
So I called them rules.
Uh-huh.
But let's see, there's 7 of them, and the first one is to always tell the truth and to do that sooner rather than later. So tell the truth sooner rather than later.
Absolutely.
And I think that's just a really important, basic, foundational rule. The second rule is when somebody shows you who they are, believe them.
Yeah.
It's actually a Maya Angelou quote, and the first time I heard it, I was like, "Oh, that is just like, I don't know, golden."
Absolutely.
And I can talk more at some point about the word "show." When someone shows you who they are, that's the key word in there for me, anyway. The third rule is to always assume the best in your partner. I found over time we tend to start to believe that our partners are hurting us on purpose.
Yeah.
They're doing things to upset us, knowing they're going to upset us. And that third rule is meant to address that pattern because it's so gets to be so insidious in relationships. The fourth rule is to know your limitations. So when you're hungry, upset emotionally about something, feeling lonely or disconnected, tired, struggling with a health condition, and even just the process of aging, all sorts of things limit our ability to engage in a constructive way with our partner. So rule number 4 is about knowing that. Rule number 5 is about knowing your own emotions, knowing what triggers you. We all have our little hot spots, the buttons, and after a while, our partners know which buttons to push.
Absolutely.
And so that's a rule about knowing that and knowing how to navigate your own emotional life. So when you're having a reaction to something, how to handle that. The 6th rule was a kind of a fun rule to give a title to. It was past plays a part, but the present is primary.
Yeah.
So it's a little tongue twister a little bit, but that's about knowing your past patterns and figuring out how to react to your partner as your partner, not as somebody from your past, like an ex or your parents or your older brother or sister, something like that.
Absolutely.
And the 7th rule is really one of my favorites, and it's always be kind, because at the end of the day, that's really what's important. And you don't always know which rule to implement. You can always be kind.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one thing that I really liked about your book is that you take the perspective that there's things that you can do in each of these areas that look at yourself and also looking at your partner and how to kind of marry those things. So maybe we can start with the first rule and talk a little bit more in depth about what that means. Just unpack it a bit for us.
Like telling the truth.
Telling the truth. That's a big
And
one.
it's a big one because so often we're afraid to tell the truth. We feel like it's going to upset somebody, or maybe if we tell the truth, we're going to lose something or miss out on something. So we don't want to speak our minds. Sometimes we don't even really know. And might take us a few minutes to figure it out or a while to figure out what the truth is. So we don't say the truth or we're hesitant. And that's a problem because you're not able to show up authentically in the relationship if you're not telling the truth. But there are times when telling the truth might not be the right thing. And so I talk in that chapter a little bit about how to navigate that line there. And I talk about, so you want to tell the truth, that can be rather hard. Like, how do you actually go about telling somebody the truth? And I have a whole section in there on communication and what's important to bring to the conversation.
Well, let's talk about some of those things.
Sure.
You said something that was really interesting, which is sometimes it may not be good to
Right.
tell the truth. So let's
Right.
unpack that a little bit more
Sure.
and just talk about when that might be, or how
Okay.
someone decides whether or not that's the route they should go, or maybe wants to go.
Well, I like to start that with that thinking process with a rather extreme example.
Okay.
Sometimes we're in relationships that are very unhealthy, and telling the truth can cause the other person to behave in really rather harmful ways.
Okay.
So this might be a domestic violence situation,
Okay.
but it may just be a situation in which the person is verbally abusive or dismissive, in which case you don't want to share that part of yourself with them because you need to stay safe.
So in those areas, telling the truth is more about revealing being vulnerable to the person.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not so much about lying to them
Right.
as it is about it's about setting boundary around what is safe to share with this person and what isn't safe to share with that person.
Right. And
Okay.
you don't want to share too much with the wrong person because you don't want to be vulnerable to the wrong person. You need to protect yourself.
Okay. And I think that's an important point to bring out and to talk about, that the example that you initially gave was around, or the couple of examples there were around relationships where there's a partnership or a romantic relationship. But that's not always the relationships we're in.
No.
We're in all kinds of relationships, and these principles would work for any relationship.
Yes. And the book was written mostly with women in mind, but the few men that I've had read it have given me feedback that the principles in the book work for them too. So they're just good all-around principles for relationships. Yeah, and so if it's your boss, like, think about it. It may not be appropriate to tell your boss the truth sometimes about certain things, about what you think of Project X or your
Absolutely.
honest opinion about your coworker. So
And that's a really good point, that depending on the role that we're in that relationship may dictate how much of the truth we talk about.
Yes.
And so, we're giving information to the other person that's appropriate to share with them. We're giving information that is relative to the whatever is sort of at the root of that relationship. But it doesn't mean that we overshare our internal dialogue.
Right. Exactly. And if you've ever been with somebody who reveals too much information, that's what we say, TMI, right?
Absolutely.
Right. So when you're telling the truth to somebody about you, you want to do it in what I like to think of as a relationally appropriate way. So if it's a casual acquaintance, you don't tell them necessarily about a really difficult episode in your life. If it's your best friend, you may then go cry on their shoulder about something that happened that was really upsetting. So you want to be appropriate.
Right. And so let's go back to the rule again.
Sure.
So remind us again of the rule.
So tell the truth sooner rather than later.
Okay. So when we're telling the truth sooner rather than later, how do we decide what the truth is? So that was a piece of what you mentioned earlier, is knowing what the truth is for you. And so how do we figure that piece out?
Some people just know what they want, and they know what they think and what they like and what works for them. And other people, it's just harder. It's because they're taking other people into account. I find this a lot with the women I work with. They've just cared for their families for so long that they've kind of lost track of what's really important to them. But this could be anybody. And that there's a whole exercise I take people through to help them start the process of figuring out what they want so they can tell the truth. Because that is a piece of it, is just even just knowing what you want.
So it's about figuring out your priorities, figuring out your values.
Yeah.
And allowing, and so the truth telling is about allowing your words to reflect the values that you hold.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Are there other pieces of telling the truth that people should be aware of?
Well, the rule says sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. If you let an untruth go on for too long, then it gets harder to tell. And there's could be more damage that has gone on, so that when you do finally reveal the truth, it's more impactful that you weren't being honest or upfront in the beginning. So I just encourage people sooner rather than later.
Okay. Yeah. And we talked earlier, this concept takes me back to this quote that says, let your yes be yes and your no be no.
Yeah.
So you're really just being authentically you,
Yeah.
and allowing people to see you as who you are, but still within that boundary that we talked about of it not making you vulnerable to people that are unsafe.
Right.
And so choosing which piece of it you're going to allow to become part of your narrative that you share with other people.
So in order to do that, you have to know what your truth is.
Yeah.
And then you pick what you share.
Right.
And so underneath all of that, and at the end of the day, when I'm working with people and we're trying to ferret out what the truth is and what they want to tell the person they're thinking about, it's at the end of the day, you want to tell the truth to yourself, 100%.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't even tell the truth to ourselves.
Yeah.
And that can be a real problem.
When it seems like that could be how it gets muddled up for people.
Yeah.
In figuring out, if they're not sure who they are.
Right.
Then if, they've altered the pieces of themselves to fit whatever situation, then it may be difficult to understand or know what your values are.
Yes.
Or what is really important to you.
Right.
To then be able to express that to someone else.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So tell the truth sooner rather than later, and even if you decide not to tell it to somebody else, tell it to yourself.
Yeah. And so know who you are, which I think is another one of your rules.
Yeah.
So we're going to get there. We're going to get there. But know who you are, but then in figuring that out, then you can say, okay, this is the truth about me, about who I am.
And what I want.
And what I want, and how I can then express that to other people in a way that's authentically me. Without, and I can do that early in the relationship.
Yes.
And not later.
Right.
Because then it creates these false impressions about who I am and what I want in and out of this relationship.
Yes. And that's actually a piece that comes up when I'm working with somebody who's dating, right? Because when you're dating, you put your best foot forward, and you don't want to bring the skeletons out of your closet. But you may also not even want to fully disclose who you are because you feel like who you are isn't good enough, or you're not, or who you like won't like that piece of you. But that's a piece of you.
Yeah.
And if they're not going to like it, maybe they're not the best person for you.
Right.
And so telling the truth in those first few weeks of first meeting somebody can also be really important for the future of the relationship.
Absolutely. And I can see that not only in romantic relationships, but also in friendships. To figure out, well, is this someone that I really can trust with this information about who I am, and make myself vulnerable to them or not? And so what's rule number 2?
Rule number 2 is when someone shows you who they are, believe them, which I think is so important, because I've seen so many people, well-meaning people, and they are coming at this with a really good heart, but they're not recognizing things about another person that may be difficult to deal with or make the person inappropriate to be in a relationship with. There's something going on there, and they need to recognize it.
Okay. So when we are on a date with someone, or we have gone out to the movies or to just have some experience with them, and they do something that's a little bit off-putting.
Yes.
That's
As
a clue.
Someone will. If they're just being themselves, they probably will do something off-putting. And the question is that a red flag? Is that something that you need to pay attention to, that is a signal that this relationship isn't going to work or not? And you don't know because you just met them, right? I had a client a number of years ago had met somebody, and she invited this person to go with her to a fundraiser. And her date proceeded to get very drunk and do some things that were a little embarrassing. And she struggled with, well, is this a red flag or not? Because she knew that this person was also having some difficulty in their life. And so she could understand why they might drink too much and not exercise good judgment. It turned out to be a problem, but you don't know that until it's happened a few times.
So how do you navigate that piece of figuring out, is this a red flag, or is this just a one-off situation that isn't going to be a problem later on?
Most of the time you have to just kind of bookmark the situation and wait and see if it happens again, because it'll be the pattern that shows you what the deal is. But other times you kind of know. So if somebody, like you're going out on a date and somebody's like, they're doing all the talking, that might tell you that they're not going to be that interested in you. Like this is their show, not about you. And you don't want to be the one doing all the talking either, but you want it to be a good back and forth.
Yeah, if you're just the spectator in the...
Right, exactly, exactly.
Okay.
And there are other things people might do that are just disrespectful, and you're thinking, oh, okay, that's not going to work. I'm not going to put up with disrespectful behavior. And the earlier it shows up in the relationship, the more likely it is to be an issue.
Okay.
Because people put their best foot forward early.
Yeah.
Right.
So if they can't mind their manners and be on, their P's and Q's on the first date, then what's it going to look like the 10th date?
10th date, exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
And in a marriage, it's a little trickier because you're married.
Right.
And you probably have kids, or you've got family is all...
There's some level of commitment there.
Yeah. And so, if you say, really the way this rule applies in that situation is just being be willing to tell yourself the truth about what you're seeing in your partner's behavior.
Okay. So when you see it, don't dismiss it.
Don't dismiss it, don't deny it.
Right, but recognize it, and then kind of bookmark it for later on in life. So just make a mental note that this is something that I've seen. It's something that isn't attractive about the person in one way or another. And I guess you would also have to evaluate, well, is that a deal breaker for you?
Exactly.
Is that something that is super important in having trust for this person? And if it's not such a big deal, you don't like the way they chew, or they don't, cover when they sneeze. For some people, that's huge.
Yeah.
That's going to be a deal breaker.
Right.
But for others, maybe it's not. Maybe it's something else. But like you said, when it comes to some of those other things that might be an indication of future abuse, whether it's towards themselves or someone else, maybe you, or if it's going to be a situation where you know something about their history that is troublesome, like maybe how they've treated other people, or something like that. That might be something that you may evaluate very early on and say, that's not a path I want to go down with this person. That's not going to be part of my journey.
Right.
So, and that's a lot. That's a lot in just 2 rules.
Exactly.
So, well, let's talk about rule number 3.
Okay, rule number 3 is to always assume the best in your partner. And like I said earlier, that rule really came out of my observation that we tend to get into these situations where we think our partners are maliciously intending to upset us or hurt us in some way, to thwart us in some way. And once that starts, you're on a really negative track because you're making some assumptions about what's going on in the head of the other person that are probably not true. I've talked to enough partners to know that it was pretty rare that they really meant it to come out that way. But because the person I'm working with is taking it that way, they can't see more gracious like versions of what might be happening there.
Okay. About when do you start applying the rule that about making the assumption that they're not intentionally trying to harm you?
Well, you could, if you've been married 20 years, you could start today.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes.
You should start today. But let's say you've just met this person. Does it apply the same then as it does later on?
I think it does, and I think it may actually be more important early on to apply it early on.
Okay.
So my thinking on that is that if you've got a history, and let's say you've had somebody cheat on you or dump you for somebody else, and those are pretty hard things to have happen.
Right.
And so you go into the next dating situation and the guy does something and it makes you think, oh my goodness, he's seeing some other woman. Let's pretend that's the scenario. Well, if you're applying the past, which is kind of like rule number 6, right? But if you have that past behavior, the past experience, you're more likely to assume he's doing this on purpose to hurt you, that he's lying to you. And it would be better at the start of the relationship to not make that assumption and to check it out. What's going on?
Right.
Yeah.
So goes back to rule number 1.
Yes. Well, and if you go through the book and you start talking about the rules, you'll start to see they all play off of each other.
Yeah. So this isn't a sequential thing.
No.
It's an aspect of you're looking at all of these things at the same time, really. So you're just keeping all of them in the back of your mind as you're kind of going through this relationship and evaluating it.
Yes.
Okay. So we are almost out of time for today, but don't worry because Dr. Shaffer is going to come back. We're going to finish talking about number 3, rule number 3, and then we're going to go through the rest of these rules. So join us again where we will complete our discussion and have better relationship.